Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Aneeka Ayanna Henderson, who is Assistant Professor of Sexuality, Women's, and Gender Studies at Amherst College. And she is the author of Veil and Vow, Marriage Matters in Contemporary African American Culture, published by our good friends down the road, UNC Press. Of Veil and Vow, Tara Hunter, the author of Bound in Wedlock, writes, Veil and Vow perfectly captures how fairy tale aspirations of wedlock intersect with supposed bootstrap mobility of the American dream. Undergirding angst about the marriage market in crisis, this book makes a major intervention in gender, sexuality, and African American studies, as well as the study of contemporary politics and culture. How are you doing today, Professor Henderson?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Mark?
I'm doing great. I really enjoyed this film a great deal, this book a great deal, and in part because, you know, while you were kind of broadly looking at the history of Black marriage, and particularly what kind of role marriage plays in the lives of Black women, you do so through the lens of popular culture, which I found just particularly refreshing because it really animates the way that popular culture has such an impression on us in terms of how we think about Black coupling and Black humanity and a range of other things. So if we could talk a little bit about how you came to this subject matter.
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of start in that first chapter, in the first page, I talk about seeing these women on the train in Chicago as I'm going to high school, and then reading these novels. I'm seeing these novels kind of pop up, and I'm so kind of fascinated by this scene, right? Because there's this kind of quiet Black reading community that's taking place on the train. And so I use that as a kind of jumping off point, as a kind of origin story for getting me to think about how important these reading communities are. I remember I was starting my research and somebody said to me, Black people don't read. And I was thinking that, well, that's absolutely preposterous. I'm seeing this every day on the train. And so it was important for me to kind of think about these readers as an essential community, making sense of the world around them through these novels. And, I felt like I could approach these novels in the same way that I could approach a novel by Toni Morrison in terms of thinking about it as a serious text that I could critically analyze with some rigor. So that was really important to me. And then also really growing up, I grew up in a kind of vibrant, predominantly Black community with my Black family. And, on the shelves, I would see the bookshelves in my home and the homes of my grandmothers. It would be novels by Harold Cruse, right? Or text by Harold Cruse, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, next to a book by Donald Goines, next to Alice Walker, and then eventually Terry McMillan. And seeing the kind of these bookshelves, right, with all of these different kinds of texts, led me to start thinking about approaching these texts with rigor, right? So these popular texts that were kind of interspersed among these kind of serious, heady texts that I actually ended up using in graduate school, pulling off my shelf and using. I think it helped me think about how I could approach these texts in a serious manner, thinking about them as important to Black communities and how they're making sense of the world.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Chicago. Yeah. And so I mean, part of the other thing too is that, I grew up during a time, the 90s, right, where we had just, one or two TVs in the house, one or two televisions, right? And right now, like everybody else has a screen that they can look at and decide what they're going to watch. But when I was growing up, if my grandfather's watching James Brown, I'm watching James Brown. if my grandmothers are watching the news or the soap operas, all my children, I'm watching those things.
Right.
So, yeah. And so I think that helped get my sensibility about the kind of ongoing conversations that were happening in my house around the kind of political landscape, and also thinking about stories about love, sentimental stories in soap operas, right? So these conversations were always ongoing, and I was trying to think about how I could bridge them together
Yeah.
In the book. And so in chapter 1, I look at Anita Baker's Fairy Tales, her song Fairy Tales, alongside Terry McMillan's, her novel Disappearing Acts, and her novel Waiting to Exhale. And then in the second chapter, I look at Public Enemy's song Sophisticated B, alongside Sister Soldier's iconic novel, The Coldest Winter.
Yep.
Yes, yes. Omar Tyree's Fly Girl, and Terry Wood's True to the Game. And then in the next chapter, I look, I take up Michael Jackson's song Black or White, and Meshell Ndegeocello's song Soul on Ice, alongside Sandra Kitt's The Color of Love, and Eric Jerome Dickey's Milk in My Coffee. And then in the next chapter, I'm looking at Sapphire's novel Push, alongside Sweet Honey and the Rock's Testimony, their song Testimony. And then the next chapter, the penultimate chapter, I am critically analyzing Gina Prince Bythewood's film, The Love and Basketball, and Malcolm D. Lee's The Best Man.
So, your comments raise a couple of questions for me. One, the idea of illuminating these texts, which, as you described earlier in the book, right, with a soundtrack, right? What's the playlist for the text, which I think does great work because, first of all, it places us in a kind of temporal moment around these texts and what's happening at the time, and also gives us a kind of sonic quality to what's happening in the world at the time. I'm curious to see how the editors at UNC responded to you when you're like, I want to do this alongside, I want to, have the text in conversation with music.
They were enthusiastic. I was so shocked. We first started this project. I was a little bit like, oh, can I do this work? Can I, is this something that will be accepted? But I think work by you, obviously, work on popular music, other folks, Trisha Rose, and I saw other people doing this work on popular texts. And I said, I want to be innovative too. I want to take this up. And they were enthusiastic about me structuring it in that way. Yeah.
The other thing is that when you mentioned some of these texts, and I'm specifically thinking about Terry McMillan and Eric Jerome Dickey, immediately I see the book covers. And you talk a little bit about how the aesthetics of the book cover and the work of Cynthia St. James, which really becomes iconic, in that moment, what's being expressed to readers and potential readers, right, in these book covers. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So again, that comes up for me in the introduction when I'm seeing these women on the train. And that was one of the things that really stuck with me were the book covers, because I hadn't seen book covers like that before, especially with so prominently featuring Black characters. I mean, of course, I saw it on Toni Morrison and other texts, but these texts seemed to stand out for me, especially as I thought about them within a network of visual culture and sartorial culture and material culture. So I think about them in the book in relationship to some of the fashion at the time. So thinking about cross colors, fashion and fashion fair, which was out and was kind of revolutionizing makeup for Black women and women of color. And so I kind of read them alongside that, but also Cynthia St. James, as you mentioned, had done the Kwanzaa stamp, right? So there's this idea that these texts are in conversation. And so Cynthia St. James had also done a cover for Alice Walker's text. And so you can see a kind of relationship between these Black women writers using kind of similar imagery across their texts, and kind of making an argument that Black women's interior lives matter, right? So that's how I'm thinking about the covers.
One of the important interventions I think the book makes, we forget, I think, as scholars definitely, that, more than 30 years after her first book, how revolutionary Terry McMillan's work was. Obviously in its centering of everyday Black women on the one hand, And as you talk about, the book covers do a great deal. The artist Cynthia St. James and the facelessness does a great deal to collapse, that space in terms of social class, as we might think about it. But what she does commercially, right, how successful her books are, for all those folks who said that Black people didn't read, the first response to that 30 years ago is Terry McMillan.
Yeah.
And then the fact that, she becomes the author that Hollywood becomes interested in taking up, right? So when we talk about Waiting to Exhale, and there's a film version of Disappearing Acts that was on HBO, this was really important work. But as you point to, she's really ground zero in terms of getting access to the private concerns of Black women about the anxieties and ambivalences about marriage. Talk about how significant Terry McMillan was, first of all, in that moment, but also in terms of the way that she talks about marriage and even what happens to her in her own life. When we think about, Stella got her groove back, about what all these kind of dynamics mean.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I situate her as being kind of groundbreaking for this work. And I even think about how she, set precedents for even a precedent for even larger kind of mainstream films such as Sex and the City, right? They're kind of four protagonists, right? All different kind of personalities. And as you point out, right? So she has film adaptations made of her work, and she was really capturing such a large segment of Black readers, Black female readers at the time. And she's still writing, of course, as we know. But she was kind of like ground zero and kind of led the way for other folks, including her own sister, Connie Briscoe, Lolita Files came after. And you can see a kind of resonance also in the book covers that come after, right? You can see how they're in conversation. If they're not by Cynthia St. James, you can see a kind of similarity in the covers. And she was capturing their interior lives, capturing the interior lives of Black women and thinking about courtship and marriage. And then, for instance, in Disappearing Acts, it's so interesting that she's using the kind of marriage plot or these kind of marriage tropes, romance tropes, but the novel doesn't end in the kind of traditional reader, I married him way that we're used to, right? So she's saying something about the ambivalence that Black women are feeling at that time where, there seems to be a kind of growing Black middle class, at least that's what the image is in the popular media. And so there's this expectation that Black women, okay, you have jobs, you're ascending the socioeconomic ladder. So this next thing is marriage and family. And Black women are thinking, okay, it's not as easy as it sounds, as the kind of trajectory is mapped onto us. They have challenges related to race, sex, gender, class, that they are wrestling with. And so they're pushing back against that kind of linear master narrative about marriage for women.
This is really a 1990s book. I mean, the text is, it feels as though you grew up in the 1990s and you had a chance, right, to add a critical lens to that experience. And one of the other values of the book is that while you're reading Black popular culture in this moment around issues of Black women and marriage, you're very cognizant of what's happening in terms of the state. So the way that you cross-read Black popular culture with the crime bill of 94 and the Defense of Marriage Act in 96, and then the welfare bill of 1996, and the ways these have very distinct and separate impacts on Black men and Black women, but ultimately Black women have to carry the water, for the impact within the communities of all of them. And so you read the crime bill against, Sister Soldiers, the coldest winter, it's interesting hearing people react to that novel, right? Because the novel is centered in the lives of a Black woman more broadly, people will typically think about it as a feminist text. And it's not necessarily that, right? And there's lots of reasons for that. And we'll talk about that a little later. But you look at her work and also that of Omar Tyree as this work that's dealing with the fact that the crime bill creates this impact on Black male lives, right? Removes them from Black communities. And it juxtaposes, right, the kind of assault that Black men are facing with Black women who have aspiration, right? And of course, basically, Tyler Perry's whole model, right, and blueprint is drawn from these novels, right? That where continuously, right, it's about what happens to Black men and the women who are aspirational have to pay for, ultimately that. Now, talk a little bit about that very interesting intersection that you bring together with the crime bill and what's happening in terms of Black fiction, in the early 1990s.
Yeah. So the crime bill got me thinking about a lot of different things broadly in Black popular culture, right? So I mentioned in the book how we have a number of films that come out around the time of the crime bill, such as New Jack City, Boys in the Hood, right? So we're getting all of these kind of images, and it helped me think about how the state was kind of decimating Black communities through incarceration, right? Privatizing solutions to social problems. And it helped me, that kind of connection, because it helped me think more about The Coldest Winter Ever and what's happening in that novel, along with Fly Girl, and thinking about the pressure and the pressure that the Black female characters are under to get married, right? As the state is continuously taking away, incarcerating Black men, Black women too, but Black men, right? But they're still feeling this pressure from the state, and then later from the Welfare Reform Act to get married, because marriage is, quote, the foundation of a successful society, I believe is what the bill says. So they're up against that, and the male characters are, of course, many of them are good looking, right? They're charismatic, but they also have these gender politics that fall back in kind of a traditional way of thinking about gender and courtship. And so Winter is, thinking about being with the male character Midnight, right? And he is also selling drugs. He is not the one incarcerated at the end. It's actually Winter, right? So this comes as a kind of punishment for her for attempting to reach beyond her means and not taking kind of personal responsibility, as it were, that, a phrase that the state is using, a phrase that cultural texts are using at the time. And so she's punished with incarceration. And so you can see the ways in which that's in conversation with the crime bill, right? Because we see that incarceration rates go up in Black communities, more prisons are being built. And so Winter kind of falls prey to that. But the punishment is not around, it's supposed to be around what she's doing in the public sphere, but really it's about her thinking about the private sphere and who she wants to be with, and being with Midnight and being with someone who makes more money than she has. So she's punished for that.
As you mentioned, these various acts that take place in the 1990s in terms of stuff that's come from the federal government, I'd be remiss not to mention the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which really actually creates a cultural and media infrastructure for so many of these narratives. And you brilliantly read what's happening in terms of Black life, particularly in the case of DOMA and the Welfare Act, against Sapphire's push. And again, I think we forget how controversial, Sapphire's push was when it was published. Folks who felt, more middle-class gatekeepers more than anything, that felt the language really undermined where Black people were at the time. And of course, we saw more of that play out, a decade later when the film version, Precious, comes out. But you, interestingly enough, talk about the shadow figure in Push, Louis Farrakhan. And Louis Farrakhan at that time is clearly not a shadow figure, right? You mentioned about his book that comes out in 1993, which alongside things like the Black Man's Guide to Black Women and things like that, are like these texts that come along to attempt to regulate Black women and their personalities, right? In the goal of bringing together a more harmonious marriage, if you will, or coupling. And, there's a way in which when I think about Farrakhan generally, but definitely in this period, and of course, the platform that he then has with the Million Man March, it's a benevolent patriarchy,
Yeah.
right? I mean, that's the best way to describe it, which I think is why so many Black women were drawn to those narratives, right? I mean, in some ways, you can't even imagine Sister Soldier and Coldest Winter without that narrative being, I mean, that's part of her political DNA. And immediately when I'm reading this section, I can remember the clip that Aisha Simmons shows in her film No, where Farrakhan is castigating and being highly critical of Desiree Washington for her own rape, by Mike Tyson. And as you talk about, this is the kind of stuff that comes out in his book and then gets parroted by Precious. And Sapphire. Talk a little bit about what it means to have this kind of patriarchal figure, basically providing voiceovers for the lives of Black women, in the context of Black women's fiction.
Yeah. I love the concept of providing a voiceover. That's so interesting. He is such a strong and charismatic figure, right? Mm-hmm. For, as you mentioned, for Precious, you can also see that as you mentioned in The Coldest Winter Ever.
And you grew up in Chicago, so you got to see that, up close and personal.
That's right. And so he's always been a kind of fascinating figure for me, but I couldn't always put my finger on why or how. And so I had to go deep into his book and really think about, okay, so what are the messages? They seem, seem fine on the surface, right?
Right.
We need to maintain Black families, or we need help or self-determination, right? But to think about how he's deploying language was really important to me, and tracing that to Precious and how she's able to buy into what he's saying, like what is making him so appealing, right? And it's definitely this sense that he's the kind of strong Black patriarch. He can help, he can protect, and Precious is such a vulnerable character. So you can see how, this figure of Farrakhan for her becomes something to latch on to, right? That can help her. But we see throughout the novel becomes a kind of hollow figure, and she eventually moves beyond that. But I was really interested in how seductive the rhetoric is with these kinds of figures, and how we can make sense of it.
And it's funny, when the Lee Daniels adaptation came out, one of the criticisms, right, from folks who might have less than progressive views of Black love and Black family was that the film in some ways, took the presence of Farrakhan out of it. Yeah. Right, in comparison to what we saw in the book. So that it's a really interesting dynamic in that regard. And of course, you finish the book with, at least for a couple of generations of Black folks, with Black America's, favorite rom-coms, Love and Basketball, and The Best Man. And before I even ask you to talk about your uses of the film in the book, it's a lazy Saturday afternoon. You don't have any place to go and any place to do. Which of those two films are you putting on?
The hard question. So I think, that's hard, because I grew up watching these films, like, and I returned to them in graduate school. It wasn't like, this is my first time watching them. I grew up, loving these films. So I think I'm going to have to go with Love and Basketball as the film I'm turning on my lazy Saturday afternoon. Yeah. Go with that. What would you turn on?
I would probably go with Love and Basketball. One, because I like the soundtrack better.
Me too.
But also because there's closure, right? It's impossible now to watch The Best Man and not know that there's something that comes afterwards
It's true.
That is not as, feel good as the original film was.
No. Yeah, that's sequel. Yeah. So it would have to be Love and Basketball for me. Yeah.
But talk a little bit about the kind of labor that both of these films do, ultimately in the support of the idea of Black marriage.
Yeah, so unlike many of the texts that I critically analyze in the rest of the book, these kind of end, at least the best man, the first best man, right? It ends with marriage, and Love and Basketball ends with marriage, not the kind of ambiguous ending that comes up in Disappearing Acts or some of the other texts. So there is a kind of ending there that is satisfying. There's a kind of nice, neat bow at the end. But I talk about, for instance, in The Best Man, I talk about how silent our protagonist, Mia, is, the kind of the woman getting married, the fiance, which is atypical in a romantic comedy. And so I was fascinated by that, by how little she speaks. It's just, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, it's under like 20 minutes in the film. And so the silencing that has to happen tells us something about what kind of labor and erasure is required for Black women to actually reach marriage, to reach the altar. So that was really important for me. That wasn't something I saw when I was, watching it when I was younger. And I approached the film thinking, oh, okay, I'm going to talk about how great, all of these depictions are. And then I found out and I was like, oh gosh, so that.
What happens to us when we do close readings?
I know, yes.
Takes all the joy out of it.
Yes, it does. And then in Love and Basketball, I talk about how when Monica, so that's, Sanaa Lathan, played by Sanaa Lathan, and Quincy, played by Omar Epps.
Omar Epps, yeah.
Yes. How when they're younger, there's this thing that happens where he keeps pushing her, right? Yeah. And so, we know now that kind of physical reaction to young girls, we once thought about that, oh, it's cute, he's showing that he likes her. But I do a close reading of these scenes where he's like constantly, or there are a few scenes where he's pushing her, and to think about what that means for their relationship, and like how she's thinking about herself, and then how she ends up, being married, right, to this guy. He seems, Quincy seems okay, but just thinking about the history of that relationship and what was required of her, the kind of silencing that's required for her to fulfill this kind of fairy tale ideal.
Yeah, and it's funny because by the time you get to the end of the film, there's a way in which he gets rehabilitated, in that closing scene.
Yeah.
And we don't get to talk about, even to get to that point, how much of herself she had to give up on and what have you.
Absolutely.
I'm gonna throw a little quirk into the question that I previously asked you about the two films. What if I throw Love Jones into the mix? Chicago Girl.
Oh yes. Oh, now it gets infinitely more difficult. Gosh, because I also love Neal Long in that. Oh, and it doesn't offer the kind of closure that Love and Basketball and The Best Man offer. Oh, I think I'm gonna have to go with Love Jones. My book is now mad at me, but that just because I love that soundtrack too. I love that soundtrack. It's so good. So maybe next week I'll have a different answer.
What's next for you, Professor Henderson?
Yeah, great question. So, I'm looking at, of course, part of my book is looking at visual culture. And so I am now doing a project on album covers of the 1990s. And I'm so excited about it because I get to just sit and look at one image and just think deeply about that image. And, and visual culture is something that's, one of my passions as I kind of show in Veil and Bound. So I'm looking at 90s album covers. Right now I'm looking at Mary J. Blige's What's the 411 album cover. And I definitely want to look at other album covers that come out of Uptown Records and think about their kind of place as a democratic form of wall art in Black communities, right? So we're seeing more people use album covers as wall art, but we're also seeing, prestigious museums, art museums, curating exhibitions with album covers. And so there's not as much done with album covers by Black artists in those spaces. And so I want to think about their place within visual culture and Black cultural production.
We've been joined today by Professor Aneeka Ayanna Henderson, who's the author of the wonderful new book, Veil and Vow, Marriage Matters in Contemporary African American Culture, published by University of North Carolina Press. Thank you very much for joining us today, Aneeka.
Thank you for having me.
Black lights and boots burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything.